Welcome back to Intro to Philosophy 1010, the summer session 2019. Here's our book, Introduction to World Philosophy, and we are now in part 3 of our book, preparing for exam 3, and the topic is metaphysics, or the study of the first principles of things, the study of reality, the study of what is real. So in the previous video, we went over Plato. He says the absolute ideas are real. Today, we're going over Berkeley and David Hume. And we know that Hume is the opposite of Plato. Plato believes in absolute eternal forms of knowledge, these absolute ideas, whereas Hume does not. He's an empiricist. But Hume's empiricism is extreme, and he's following Berkeley. And Berkeley kind of straddles the fence between empiricism and rationalism. He doesn't believe in Plato's absolute ideas, these eternal, unchanging forms of reason. But on the other hand, he doesn't believe in matter either. He doesn't believe in an unthinking substance that exists outside of a mind. For Berkeley, all that exists are ideas and the minds that perceive them. Nothing can exist that isn't perceived other than the perceiving mind itself. So Hume will say, there's no mind either. If I can't perceive a mind, then it too doesn't exist. There's only a constant flux of sense perceptions, which gives us the illusion of a self. So we saw that in the beginning of the semester where we were comparing Hume to the Buddhists, who also say there is no self, it's just a word that's applied to an ever-changing flux of sensations and memories and emotions and all these other different constantly changing experiences. So in preparation for exam 3, in this video I'm going over part A, question 2, why does George Berkeley think there is no difference between primary and secondary qualities of matter? Do you agree? Why or why not? And then I'll be going over part B, question 3, how is George Berkeley's theory of ideas different than Plato's theory of ideas? Okay, so the primary and secondary qualities of matter. It's pretty straightforward. George Berkeley is responding to John Locke, who is a British empiricist. He says knowledge comes through your sense perceptions. Okay, well, what is matter? And then Locke says, well, there's two qualities of matter, the primary qualities and the secondary qualities. The secondary qualities are things like color and heat, or, is it hot or cold? Is something moving fast or slow? Those are all dependent upon your subjective perspective. It'll seem different to different people, to different species. But he says there's also primary qualities of matter that don't depend on the subjective interpretation of them. And those are things like extension in space and solidity and just the bare idea of movement. So those primary qualities, Berkeley says, are just as much in the mind as the secondary qualities. That you cannot think of the primary qualities without automatically attaching the secondary qualities to them. So, the matter, it's not large or small, but it does have extension in space. Okay, can you imagine extension in space that is neither large nor small? Can you imagine a solid object without imagining what shape it has? So if it's impossible to think of the primary qualities without attaching the secondary qualities, then they both exist in the mind. And furthermore, it is impossible to even conceive of an unthinking material substance existing outside of a mind, because the very thought itself puts that object in your mind. You can pretend that you can imagine a tree outside, whether you're looking at it or not, but that very thought experiment is putting that tree inside your mind. It's impossible to conceive of an object outside of the mind, because as soon as you try to do it, there it is, it's in your mind. Well, then does that mean things cease to exist when no one's observing them? And we'll see in the introductory notes on page 466, the very last paragraph, no, Berkeley says, but only because God perceives them. It's the last sentence. It's at a very important point. It only gets one sentence, and it's not even in the selections we're reading. That's the introductory note. All right, so my car is parked outside. Will it be there if I'm not observing it or someone else isn't observing it? Yes, it's always going to be there, says Berkeley, because it'll be there in God's mind. But it's still just an idea. In this case, it's an idea in God's mind. So everything breaks down to either ideas or the minds that perceive them. So the two readings that we'll have are excerpts from George Berkeley's Three Dialogues between Hylas and Philonous, and excerpts from Principles of Human Knowledge. And then we'll also go over very briefly David Hume's A Treatise of Human Nature, a very brief selection. So they both say there's no such thing as material substance enduring through space and time outside of a thinking mind. There's just sensations. Hume will say there's not even a mind perceiving them. There are only sensations. And the idea of a mind is just a fiction. So let's just get into the readings here. So the first one, Three Dialogues between Hylas and Philonous. Hylas is taking John Locke's philosophy of primary and secondary qualities of matter, and Philonous is representing Berkeley's philosophy, which is that there's no matter existing outside of a mind, and so there's no difference between primary and secondary qualities. They all exist in the mind. So I'll just read a little bit to get a flavor of this reading. So Hylas says, I frankly own, Philonous, that it is in vain to stand out any longer. Colors, sounds, tastes, in a word, all those termed secondary qualities have certainly no existence without the mind. But by this acknowledgment, I must not be supposed to derogate the reality of matter or external objects. For the clearer understanding of this, you must know sensible qualities are by philosophers divided into primary and secondary. The former are extension, figure, solidity, gravity, motion, and rest. Those are primary qualities. And these they hold exist really in bodies. The latter are those above enumerated, or briefly all sensible qualities, besides the primary, which they assert are only so many sensations or ideas existing nowhere but in the mind. So, Philonous says, are you still then of opinion that extension and figure are inherent in external, unthinking substances? Hylas says, I am. But what if the same arguments which are brought against secondary qualities will hold good against these also? Why, then I shall be obliged to think they too exist only in the mind. So that, in the end, is what Philonous is going to convince Hylas of, or at least get him to admit that he has no reason not to admit what Philonous is saying. So the first example Philonous uses is these primary qualities are just as relative as the secondary qualities. So, and he uses the example of a mite, a tiny little animal. What appears huge to that tiny little animal will still appear tiny to us. So it depends on our subjective perspective, just like color. What appears blue to somebody might appear green to somebody else, or if someone who's colorblind, it'll be gray. So if those are secondary qualities are dependent upon your subjective perspective, and therefore they're only in the mind, the same argument holds for the primary qualities. So the bottom of page 467 of the right-hand column, Philonous says, is it not the very same reasoning to conclude there is no extension or figure in an object, because to one eye it shall seem little, smooth and round, when at the same time it appears to the other great, uneven, and regular? Okay, so later on he says, if it be allowed that no idea, nor anything like an idea, can exist in an unperceiving substance, then surely it follows that no figure or mode of extension which we can either perceive or imagine or have any idea of can be really inherent in matter. Not to mention the peculiar difficulty there must be in conceiving a material substance prior to and distinct from extension to be the substratum of extension. Be the sensible quality what it will, figure or sound or color, it seems alike impossible it should subsist in that which doth not perceive it. So all of these ideas of solidity and extension in space, they're all ideas in the mind. Ideas are like nothing but other ideas. That's another point that Berkeley makes. So how could an idea be like something that isn't an idea? In other words, unthinking substance that exists outside of a mind. Where would be the point of contact? We saw the same problem with René Descartes when he says mind is thinking substance that's not extended in space, and matter is unthinking substance that is extended in space. Okay, says Princess Elizabeth, where do they touch? How can your mind make your body move, and how can things that happen to your body affect your mind? If you hold your hand over a flame, your mind senses pain. Where's that point of contact? If your mind says, right hand, move away from the flame, and it does it, how did your mind have contact with the hand to make it move? Because the mind has no extension in space. How can it move something that has extension in space? So they're unlike each other. That was Descartes' idea. Descartes didn't point out that problem. Princess Elizabeth pointed that out. But Berkeley's using the same logic about the relationship between ideas in our mind and matter. How do they touch? Ideas are absolutely unlike the material objects they supposedly represent, so how can they represent them? He presents arguments about that. I'm not going to read through all of it, but I'm just giving an overview to make sense of his philosophy, which I don't think is as complicated as some of the other philosophies we've read so far. And then he goes on to give Hylas an example of how it's not only is it illogical to say there's matter existing outside of the mind, but you can't even conceive of that being the case. So Hylas says, if it comes on page 468, the right-hand column, if it comes to that point, the point will soon be decided. What more easy than to conceive a tree or house existing by itself, independent of and unperceived by any mind whatsoever? I do at this present time conceive them existing after that manner. So then Philonous will say, no, you don't. You're thinking of a tree or a house in your mind right now. So how is it that you've just proved to me that matter can exist outside of a mind? So how then came you to say you conceived a house or tree existing independent and out of all minds whatsoever? Then Hylas says, that was, I own, an oversight. But stay, let me consider what led me into it. And then skipping down, Philonous says, you acknowledge then that you cannot possibly conceive how any one corporeal, sensible thing should exist otherwise than in the mind. So then he says, Hylas says, I do, and yet you will earnestly contend for the truth of that which you cannot so much as conceive, meaning matter existing outside of the mind. You still think that exists? Hylas says, to speak the truth, Philonous, I think there are two kinds of objects, the one perceived immediately, which are likewise called ideas. The other are real things or external objects, perceived by the mediation of ideas. So then he'll say, okay, how do these ideas mediate the things that are supposedly there existing outside of the mind? How can they contact each other? They're so unalike. The ideas are constantly changing and the physical objects are supposed to be the same. So if you look on page 470 in the right-hand column, Philonous is saying, and there's another important point, so Hylas says, real things, it is plain, have a fixed and real nature, which remains the same notwithstanding any change in our senses. So then Philonous says, how then is it possible that things perpetually fleeting and variable as our ideas should be copies or images of anything fixed and constant? So where's this contact point? And I'll point out here, the same argument applies to Berkeley's distinction between ideas and the minds that perceive them. Nothing is like an idea but another idea, he'll say on page 471. So Philonous says, but how can that which is sensible be like that which is insensible? Can a real thing in itself invisible be like a color? Or a real thing which is not audible be like a sound? In a word, can anything be like a sensation or idea but another sensation or idea? All right, well, what about a mind? Where's the point of contact between the minds that perceive ideas and the ideas themselves? They're two different types of things. And if nothing can be like an idea other than another idea, then how does a mind contain the ideas? The ideas should just flow right through the mind. There's no point of contact. He does not bring up that point. I think that's a weak point in his argument. Hume does reject the idea of a mind, because it isn't perceivable by the sensation, the sense perceptions, and therefore it doesn't exist other than as a figment. Well, what is it a figment of? A figment of your imagination. Well, doesn't the mind have to exist to have an imagination? Hume will say, if you can't perceive it with your sense perceptions, then it's only a figment. All right, so that he has problems too. Well, what's having the, like Descartes said, maybe I'm deceived, but I must exist as a thinking thing in order to be deceived. So let's go. All right, but actually, before I move on to the next principles of human knowledge, here's an important point. On page 470, in the left-hand column, Philonous says, my aim is only to learn from you the way to come at the knowledge of material beings. Whatever we perceive is perceived immediately or mediately by sense or by reason and reflection. So either you perceive something directly, or you can have thoughts that occur because you're remembering past sense perceptions and combining those memories in different ways. So, but as you have excluded sense, so sense can't show us a physical object. Physical objects aren't perceivable by senses. This is what he's saying. So then how do you know material objects exist outside of a thinking mind? So, but as you have excluded sense, pray show me what reason you have to believe their existence, or what medium you can possibly make use of to prove it, either to mine or your own understanding. And then Hylas says, to deal ingenuously, Philonous, now I consider the point. I do not find I can give you any good reason for it, but thus much seems pretty plain, that it is at least possible such things may really exist, meaning material objects, and as long as there is no absurdity in supposing them, I am resolved to believe as I did, till you bring good reasons to the contrary. Then Philonous says, what? Is it come to this, that you only believe the existence of material objects, and that your belief is founded barely on the possibility of its being true? So he's brought him to that extent, that the belief in matter has no reasons behind it. And Hylas says, well, it could be. It's possible that there's such a thing as matter. And then Philonous says, is that any kind of a good reason to believe in something? So now I will, actually, while we're on this, I'm going to begin to answer question number 2 for part A. Well, wait a minute. No, I'm going to talk now about question 3 from part B. How is George Berkeley's theory of ideas different than Plato's theory of ideas? Okay, so for Plato, he has his theory of absolute ideas, eternal, fixed forms of knowledge that the soul can perceive, but that are imperceptible to any sense perceptions. As a matter of fact, if you're distracted by any sense perceptions, you cannot open the eye of the soul to these absolute forms. Berkeley does not believe in a two-world theory. He doesn't think that this world is like the dream projected from an eternal world of spiritual forms that are unchanging. For Berkeley, this is the only world, and everything we perceive is just that, a perception. Another word for which is an idea in our mind. And all of the so-called physical objects are actually ideas in God's mind. So Plato had the theory of ideas in God's mind, and those ideas exist at the outermost sphere of the universe, as we read in the Phaedrus. And that agrees with the Hindu philosophy and the Upanishads. But for Berkeley, that's not the case. For Berkeley, the physical objects you see themselves, those are God's ideas. God has an idea of many trees. There's not one absolute perfect essential idea of a tree in God's mind located out at the horizon of the cosmos, and that all of the individual trees that we perceive here are participating in that archetypal tree. That's not the case for Berkeley. The pine tree, the oak tree, all the different versions of trees, they are all independent, unique ideas in God's mind. And we can perceive them also, but nothing exists other than ideas and the minds that perceive them. So that is a big difference. So when I read about this, that according to Hylas, material objects are fixed and real and unchanging, and our ideas of them are constantly changing. So Philonous says, well, How can something so fleeting like our ideas represent something so stable and enduring like a so-called physical thing? For Plato, the ideas, the absolute ideas, are what's fixed and real, and the physical objects are constantly changing. So it kind of reverses it. If you look on page 254 of the Phaedo, then we'll just to go over this. He says he's saying on page 254, now the compound or composite may be supposed to be naturally capable of being dissolved just as it was compounded, but what is uncompounded, and that only, must be indissoluble if anything is. Yes, that's what I'd imagine, said Keves. And the uncompounded may be assumed to be the same and unchanging, where the compound is always changing and never the same. That I also think, he said. Then now let's return to the previous discussion. Is the idea or essence, which in the dialectical process we define as the essence of true existence, whether essence of equality, beauty, or anything else, are these essences, I say, liable at times to some degree of change? Or are they each of them always what they are, having the same simple, self-existent, and unchanging forms, and not admitting of variation at all, or in any way, or at any time? They must always be the same, Socrates, replied Keves. And what would you say of the many beautiful things? They're almost always changing. You can perceive those with the senses, but the unchanging things you can only perceive with the mind. All right, so that, and then over on the right-hand column, Socrates says, but when returning into herself, the soul that is, she reflects, then she passes into the realm of purity and eternity and immortality and unchangeableness, which are her kindred, and with them she ever lives when she is by herself unhindered. Then she ceases from her erring ways, and being in communion with the unchanging is unchanging, and this state of the soul is called wisdom. Yes, all right, so the ideas for Plato are eternal and unchanging absolute forms of knowledge that exist in the mind of God, which is the outermost sphere of the universe. And for Berkeley, his theory of ideas is that what we call material objects are actually just assemblages of ever-fleeting ideas. The apple is a constant stream of seeing a reddish color and its shape, and our feeling the texture of it. It's kind of smooth, the solidity of it. It's not a single enduring thing existing outside of a mind. It's a streaming series of sense perceptions. And that enduring quality of it, in the sense that at least others can perceive it and it seems to be relatively the same to everybody, is due to the fact that it's an idea in God's mind. So Berkeley does believe in God, and he does believe in minds, just like Plato. In other words, the immaterial soul, he believes in that. But he doesn't believe in the absolute archetypal forms of things. And as a matter of fact, he reverses the use of that word archetype, and he applies that to material objects, because he's trying to show that they're just as impossible as Plato's theory of these abstract forms, that the idea of a material object, unthinking substance existing outside of a mind, is just as unnecessary and unprovable as Plato's theory of these archetypal ideas that we cannot perceive with our sense perceptions. So he's saying, if you look on page 470, and I've read this before, but I'll read it again just to get this idea of the archetype. So as for other things, it is plain they are only suggested to the mind by experience, grounded on former perceptions. But to return to your, but to return to your comparison of Caesar's picture, which I didn't get into, it is plain, if you keep to that, you must hold the real things or archetypes of our ideas are not perceived by sense, but by some internal faculty of the soul, as reason or memory. I would therefore fain know what arguments you can draw from reason for the existence of what you call real things or material objects. So Hylas says, I don't know, I don't have a reason to explain the existence of these archetypes of our ideas. We see an apple, that's the idea we have in our mind. The apple itself would be the archetype of our idea. So he's using Plato's language, but he's saying, what reason do you have to believe in the existence of these archetypes? But by that, again, he means what we take to be unthinking substances existing out of the mind. Okay, so now the same basic arguments he goes over in Principles of Human Knowledge. This time it's not a dialogue, he's just writing straightforward. And so I'll read through it here. Some there are who make a distinction betwixt primary and secondary qualities. This is page 471. By the former they mean extension, figure, motion, rest, solidity, impenetrability, and number. By the latter they denote all other sensible qualities as colors, sounds, tastes, and so forth. The ideas we have of these last they acknowledge not to be the resemblance of anything existing without the mind or unperceived, but they will have our ideas of the primary qualities to be patterns or images of things which exist without the mind in an unthinking substance, which they call matter. By matter, therefore, we are to understand an inert, senseless substance in which extension, figure, and motion do actually subsist. But it is evident from what we have already shown that extension, figure, and motion are only ideas existing in the mind, and that an idea can be like nothing but another idea, and that consequently neither they nor their archetypes can exist in an unperceiving substance. Hence it is plain that the very notion of what is called matter or corporeal substance involves a contradiction in it. All right, so he just summarized his whole argument there. And again, you saw he called matter, the unthinking substance outside of a mind, an archetype, because our ideas of it aren't what it is in itself, but our ideas vaguely represent the thing itself. But Berkeley's saying what that thing is that you perceive is just an idea in your mind. And it exists similarly to everyone else's perceiving mind because it endures in God's much more powerful mind. And again, there's only one sentence about that in the introductory remarks on page 466, the very last sentence. So I will, and this will support also that part B question about comparing Berkeley's theory of ideas to Plato's. If you look on page 472, paragraph 17 on the right-hand column, he says, if we inquire into what the most accurate philosophers declare themselves to mean by material substance, we shall find them acknowledged they have no other meaning annexed to those sounds but the idea of being in general, together with the relative notion of its supporting accidents. The general idea of being appeareth to me the most abstract and incomprehensible of all others. And as for its supporting accidents, thus, as we have just now observed, cannot be understood in the common sense of those words. All right, so the general idea of being, that's like Plato's idea of the good, which we read in the cave allegory on page 436. So the cave allegory is like the prisoners chained up in the cave who can only see the shadows cast on the back wall from the puppets that are walked back and forth by guards behind them, with this blazing fire above the entrance to this underground cave, casting those shadows of the puppets onto the wall. The prisoners think the shadows are reality. Then they're turned around and they have to deal with the blinding light of the fire. They're pulled out of the cave. Finally, they can see the sun itself, which is the source of everything else. So the allegory is, as the fire in the cave is to the sun, so is the sun to the idea of the good. We live as if in a cave of shadows. These three-dimensional objects are like shadows of their archetypal forms, which are all condensed in the idea of the good. That's what, on page 472, Berkeley is calling the idea of being in general. The general idea of being appeareth to me the most abstract and incomprehensible of all others. Well, it is for Plato as well. It's the most abstract and therefore the most real. It cannot be perceived by any of your sense perceptions. So I'll just read a little bit of this. So Socrates says, but whether true or false, my opinion is that in the world of knowledge, the idea of good appears last of all and is seen only with an effort. When seen, it's also inferred to be the universal author of all things beautiful and right, parent of light and of the Lord of light in this visible world, and the immediate source of reason and truth in the intellectual. This is the power upon which he who would act rationally, either in public or private life, must have his eye fixed. Now he's talking about the mind's eye, not the physical eye. So for Berkeley, he's rejecting Plato's theory of these archetypal ideas, culminating with the idea of the good. But he also rejects the idea of unthinking substance existing outside of a mind, or in other words, matter. So he's not a rationalist like Plato, but he's not a materialist either. He's kind of straddling the fence because he believes in God and a soul, and he thinks all that exists are minds and the ideas that perceive them, but not these absolute, unchanging, eternal ideas, which he's calling archetypes. The ideas that exist in God's mind are the physical things we see. And they do change, although he's in the dialogue with Hylas and Philonous, he's saying that our ideas are changing, but the archetypes, meaning the physical objects, they don't change. So they have some relative stability to them, but not the eternal, unchanging kind that Plato would say his archetypal forms have. Okay, so on the page 473, and then he points out again, you can't even conceive of the idea of an object existing outside of the mind, because as soon as you try to, you've just put it inside your mind. So on the right-hand column of page 473, to conclude this section from, what is it called again, Principles of Human Knowledge, he says, to make out this, it is necessary that you conceive them existing unconceived. So to think of an unperceiving substance existing outside of a perceiving mind, as soon as you postulate that, you've defeated that whole principle. So he's saying, but the mind, taking no notice of itself, is deluded to think it can, and does, conceive bodies existing unthought of or without the mind. So the mind just doesn't take notice of itself. All it experiences is sense perceptions, and it forgets that it's perceiving them. So you see, Berkeley is not a strict empiricist, because the mind cannot perceive itself. You can infer that it must exist, because we're having ideas. They must adhere in some container like a mind. Hume will say, oh yeah, show me that container. I don't perceive it with any of my 5 sense organs, and therefore it's not real. So let me just go on now to David Hume. And the question for him is in part B, number 4, why does Hume reject the idea of substance? So he gives the same reasons that Berkeley gives. And this is beginning on page 473 from a treatise of human knowledge. Hume says, I would fain ask those philosophers who found so much of their reasonings on the distinction of substance and accident. Oh, this is starting to be annoying there. Let me get rid of that. All right, so I would fain ask those philosophers who found so much of their reasonings on the distinction of substance and accident, and imagine we have clear ideas of each, whether the idea of substance be derived from the impressions of sensation or of reflection. So what are you talking about, substance? Are you perceiving that with one of your sense perceptions, or are you just inferring that in your mind? So he says, if it be conveyed to us by our senses, I ask which of them, and after what manner? If it be perceived by the eyes, it must be a color. If it be the ears, a sound. If by the palate, a taste, and so of the other senses. But I believe none will assert that substance is either a color or a sound or a taste. The idea of substance must therefore be derived from an impression of reflection. So some inference in your mind, if it really exists. But the impressions of reflection resolve themselves into our passions and emotions, none of which can possibly represent a substance. That's similar to Berkeley's argument. Nothing can be like an idea but another idea. So we have therefore no idea of substance distinct from that of a collection of particular qualities, nor have we any other meaning when we either talk or reason concerning it. All right, so particular qualities is particular sense perceptions. What's an apple? It's a red color, it's a sweet taste, it's a this texture, it's a that. You know, if you tap it, it makes a certain sound. The 5 sense organs are receiving a flux of sense perceptions, and we unify them in our imagination into a single enduring object, but actually it's just a constantly fleeting series of sense impressions. There is no such thing as a physical object enduring outside of a perceiving mind. And Hume will say there's not even a perceiving mind, there's just perceptions. That's all we can be sure of. You know, he's a skeptic. So continuing here on page 474, he's saying on the left-hand column, the idea of a substance as well as that of a mode is nothing but a collection of simple ideas that are united by the imagination and have a particular name assigned them by which we are able to recall, either to ourselves or others, that collection. But the difference betwixt these ideas consists in this, that the particular qualities which form a substance are commonly referred to an unknown something in which they are supposed to inhere, or, granting this fiction should not take place, are at least supposed to be closely and inseparably connected by the relations of contiguity and causation. Okay, so there's all right, even if you grant, oh, an apple, it's a series of sense perceptions, red color and this taste and the other thing, well, all of those sense perceptions in here, they coagulate within this unthinking substance. That's what most of us think. He's saying that's a fiction. But even where subtler minds realize that the idea of a solid object that endures through space and time, the same to itself from one moment to the next, is a fiction, still they'll say, but still there is this unit, because all of those streams of sense perceptions are connected by the relations of contiguity and causation. So we saw in the beginning of the semester, Hume says he attacked the idea of cause and effect as one of the principal reasons for the illusion of believing in an individual, unchanging self. This event happens, and then that event happens. But to say that the one caused the other would require that you perceive that causal link. And as an empiricist, he says, I can't see it or smell it or taste it or touch it or hear it, so it doesn't exist. It's a figment of the imagination. And so all the same arguments he uses against the idea of a self also apply to the idea of a material object enduring through space and time. An unthinking substance existing outside of a mind is just as implausible, says Hume, as the idea of a thinking mind staying identical to itself from one moment to the next. So he abandons the idea of matter, and he abandons the idea of mind. All that he believes in is what he directly experiences, and all that he directly experiences are sense perceptions themselves. Just because you have a sense perception of red doesn't mean it corresponds to anything existing outside of your perception of it. So he's just following Berkeley and is not believing in matter. And then on the right-hand column of 474, he'll admit that the idea of cause and effect are necessary for our survival, and upon their removal, human nature must immediately perish and go to ruin. But the idea of a material substance existing outside of a mind, he's saying that's not necessary. He's saying that, upon their removal, human nature must, but the latter, meaning substance, are neither unavoidable to mankind nor necessary or so much as useful in the conduct of life, but on the contrary are observed only to take place in weak minds. So he's saying you don't have to have a belief in a material substance that endures outside of a thinking mind in order to survive. You can disregard that. He's saying, granted, the idea of cause and effect, even though it's only derived from custom, you usually see things follow that order, and so you assume they always will in the future. He says that's not true. It's still a fiction, but it's invaluable for the human species to survive. So, but we can get rid of the idea of material substances existing outside of the mind without any adverse effect, and it will actually help us think more clearly and get rid of the specters of ancient philosophers who think about these kinds of things. On page 475, on the left-hand column, he says, the opinions of the ancient philosophers, they're fictions of substance and accident. So accident are the qualities that attach to a substance, like the redness, the colors, the taste, the sounds, and the substance is the material thing itself, or a spiritual substance would be a soul. So the opinions of the ancient philosophers, they're fictions of substance and accident, and their reasonings concerning substantial forms and occult qualities are like the specters in the dark, and are derived from principles which, however common, are neither universal nor unavoidable in human nature. And so then he goes on to attack the modern philosophy, meaning John Locke's philosophy of primary and secondary qualities. And we went over the same arguments that Berkeley had before. So